Hello and welcome to a video where I'm gonna explain some things I did for the last animation. If you've seen it, it's the Jackboy animation. If you haven't seen it, go watch it. I'll wait. It's not very long because I'm lazy. But I wanted to talk about a couple of things that I had to sort of do differently this time around, or wanted to do differently this time around, and some things that I had to sort of trial and error my way through to come up with at all, or to do at all. And I am very smart, as you probably can tell by my t-shirt, so try to keep up, will you? Jokes! But it is gonna be a two-part video, because I recorded it all already. I'm editing it right there, and I'm obviously recording the intro and outro back to back, because why wouldn't I? But it just turned out too long. It turned out to be like almost 40 minutes long. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna split this up into two videos. This part, the first part, is gonna be the lighting on the rooftop scene and the running tunnel with the lights whooshing past and running the super speed with the logo showing up. And the next part is gonna be some little bits here and there. It's gonna be some of the animation and the rigging, it's gonna be the anti-bits, it's gonna be just in general what I couldn't fit into this video. So I hope you find it interesting, and I hope I don't ramble too much. Let's go into the computer. Do a zoom on the like as if we're diving into it. Can we do that? Me?
So for the running shot where Jackboy Man is running super fast and lights are whooshing past and we get to the logo, this is actually my favorite shot of the animation. This one took a bit of trial and error to figure out, because I knew what I wanted it to look like, but I had no idea how to actually do it. At first I thought about modeling a very rough city and putting random light sources in and have that actually whoosh past really fast, but when I thought about that, it just seemed like a lot of unnecessary time spent just doing that, just to get this shot. So what the actual shot ended up looking like is wholly faked. It's all smoke and mirrors. It's very, very simple in the end. I have a very long tube that is just whooshing past, and actually Jackboy Man, throughout the entire animation, or the entire shot, you can see him here in the middle, he's actually stationary throughout the whole shot. The only movement he has is slightly forwards and then sideways when he's running to the side. So all of this is, all of the whooshy movement of the light sources is a long tube just moving past Jackboy Man very rapidly. And you can see it here. If I play the animation through, you can see the tube moving past. And this little bit in the middle, that is where Jackboy Man is. But the tube is moving around him. And the whole point of the tube is to get these lights that are both light sources and colorful and pretty looking, almost like a cityscape, but also smeared and to simulate the speed. So how I did this was I made a long tube and I spliced it up into sections. You can see here there's a couple of sections here. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, I think 10 total of just bits of polygons. And what I did with this is that each of these sections I UV mapped to a specific square of the UV layout here. So this first bit is one section, and the second bit is the next, and the next bit is the next, and the next bit is the next, and then I start over. So when this tube is whizzing past, I can have different maps, different backgrounds, so it looks less repetitive, but I don't have to do any sort of specific special weird UV map switching, assigning to polygons, whatever. And what I did for this is I just Googled up some images of cities and then blurred them and zoomed them and colored them heavily in Photoshop. As you can see here, this is a street. I Googled street background, which isn't something I would use as is, but since they are used as a blurry, heavily modified and colorized backdrop for a whooshy tunnel, I figured it was okay. So this is what I did for the texture of that, and to get this tunnel to be a light source as well, I just signed the same texture as incandescence. So you can see here's the shader for the tunnel. Didn't even name it. I'm a rebel like that. What are you gonna do, sue me? I've just assigned the exact same texture as incandescence, which means incandescence means that the lighter parts of an image will give off more light and the darker parts will give off less light. And Redshift works in a very good way with this, I think, because you can assign an image independently of the intensity. So by default, this is a 1 value, and if I render this, you'll see that the whole everything is a lot darker. But if I bump this up to 10, you get the nice sort of even glow that isn't too overexposed, but isn't dark at the same time. If I were to bump this to 100, you can see that everything starts to blow out and the colors starts to lose information and just blend together into a weird mess. So that was a bit of trial and error. And also the speed of this tunnel was a bit of a trial and error thing, because I wanted it to, even though it has the smeared backdrops, it needed motion blur. So if I go into the render settings here and turn motion blur off, you're gonna see how that would look. You can see that it does change the background. They're not, the light sources aren't as smeared, and you begin to see the edges between the actual textures a lot more, which was my main issue. Like, because when you get to one of these sections, polygonal sections of the tube, you could see the texture sort of clipping into the next city map. So enabling motion blur did hide that somewhat. And since it whooshes by so fast, it's near impossible to detect unless you know about it. That, coupled with depth of field, I think made it all fairly convincing as a running through cityscape scene. If I turn the motion or the depth of field off, you can see that suddenly the tunnel becomes a lot more evident and doesn't look nearly as good. But keeping the depth of field fairly shallow and the tunnel very long and larger in scale, it blurred things in a very nice and smooth fashion, and it gave me the look that I wanted. The floor was another issue I had, because I did want to have some sort of contact as if he was running on something. And when I did this scene from the start, I didn't have a floor, but that makes it look kind of weird and kind of like he's just flying through a weird tunnel of light rather than actually running very fast. So what I did for the floor is I added just a very simple road mesh that has just a few edges to simulate sidewalks, which doesn't really show up anyway, but it made it look decent. But my main issue with this was that originally it looked like this, which was just a very flat and boring sort of thing that he was running on. It didn't feel like it belonged in the scene. Sure, there's reflections, but it took up too much screen space, screen real estate for my liking. So what I ended up doing with this, which was another trial and error thing, is that you can see that there are still reflections, but it's a very uneven and weird, undefined shape. And if you move along in the timeline here, you can see that the shape isn't solid. It's kind of changing throughout. And if I go here, you can see that, oh, there's sort of reflections here, and then they sort of disappear, and then they come back over here. And what I did to achieve that effect is that I assigned a ramp to the opacity of the actual plane. If I go into the this is the floor shader, and if I go into the ramp here, you can see that I have just a ramp that goes from black to white. Black meaning no opacity, but completely translucent, completely invisible, and then white is fully visible. And I added some noise to this. You can see the sample here, that it's not a smooth, consistent ramp like this, like that, because that would just cause the ramp to be a softened field in the middle, which is not what I was looking for. So I added some random noise values to this, which made for an interesting effect actually, because as he's moving through, or as the tunnel is moving beyond or past him, the floor is moving as well. And since the floor opacity is mapped to a randomized noisy ramp, as he's running, the parts of the ramp are actually whizzing by as well. So as he's running along, the floor is actually randomized to be visible in different areas based on this ramp. And it turned out to be a cool little effect, because while it was still present enough to cause him to have a sort of surface to run on, it almost ended up looking like puddles of water on a street. And you could still see the environment through it at different points in time. So I sort of had my cake at 82, in the sense that it wasn't a solid chunk, but I could still have some sort of sense of reflections and contact with a surface. And for the lighting in this shot, the tunnel wasn't really enough to light everything up, so I do have, I do have a couple of light sources on either side of him, and these are just white spotlights to give him the sort of edge light here and here on his hair, just to sort of make him stand out and pop a bit more against the background so he doesn't blend in too much. You can see that he's lit up on his sides here and here, and the edges of the hair, which I think just makes for a nice dynamic shot where he's still visible and stands out against this very colorful and kind of messy background. And when it came to the logo flashing in a lens flare in the actual animation, I decided to save that as a separate scene just so I wouldn't mess anything up. But it's literally just a copy of the scene where his animations, Jack's animations, are sort of frozen in time. So if I move along here, you can see that he's not running anymore. I literally just made a keyframe where the running animation stops, and then at the end of this timeline, and just moved him along slightly to give him some sort of movement. So it wasn't I didn't want a frozen shot. I wanted it to be a sudden, almost like a sudden slow motion. So I made him drift slightly, and same for the logo, just because it made it somewhat more interesting. So I have the logo here sort of drifting towards the camera, and the square behind it just rotating slightly to give it some life. And what I did for this was I froze the tunnel and I rendered it out, but I rendered it without the tunnel present at all. So if I'll do a test render here, you can see that there's just black behind him, but we still have the lighting and the reflections of the tunnel. Doing this is simple. You go into the cylinder render stats and you just uncheck primary visibility. So you just uncheck that and you get the nice clean plate here. And for the background of this shot, I actually rendered out the very last shot, the very last frame of the tunnel moving on its own without the logo or the character or anything. I only rendered the tunnel because that would give it the exact same frame as the actual running ended on, while still keeping the motion blur and the depth of field and anything to match that shot. And what I did in post is I hid that transition with a lens flare just to make it a bit more hidden, that it's actually just a still frame of the tunnel from the exact previous frame.
Little tricks like that, you gotta cheat the system sometimes. Shh, don't tell anybody though.
I wanted to quickly talk about the lighting in the rooftop scene in particular, because it's kind of specific and it's kind of cheaty. There's a lot of keyframing on frames that goes on here, and I'll show you what I mean in a second. This is the basic setup. We have the rooftop with all of the stuff, and we have the cityscape in the background, which is I spent a lot of time modeling this because I wanted it to look perfect. So here we have Jackboy Man. He's just landed. He's coming in from nowhere. I guess he's just been to space, and he does the superhero landing. And I did a lot of stretching for this part because it looks funny. Pow. So he does that, and he stands here and he does his shtick. Schniepelstein has got to wait his turn all the way up here. But in terms of lighting, we have the general light source here, which is a dome light, an ambient light source, which is a dark blue, kind of low-key, not very prominent light, but it does add a sort of scene sense. It does add a sort of a weather or time of day to it, because if I go into this camera where we have some overview of the entire shot, if I turn it off, you can see that everything turns very, very dark and very less colorful, very black, I guess. But with this on, you get this nice overcast of blue, maybe a bit of a nighttime look to it, I think anyway. And it also adds colors into the scene, which is one of the main themes of this animation, is to have as much color as possible without having things clash and feel weird and just in your face. But one thing I did do with the light sources here is that you can see these two, this light and this light, they sort of bounce around the scene based on what's going on. And I wanted to make for a dramatic lighting here. I wanted to have something that didn't necessarily look realistic, but still looked good. And I almost wanted it to feel fake. I wanted it to feel exaggerated, sort of like, you know, the Marvel movies or comic books, and just in general, not necessarily focus on the real, but to focus on what looked cool and looked good, which isn't something I've done before, so it's kind of tricky, but I tried anyway. And I kind of like doing this because it gives you more freedom to not really care about what would actually work and what wouldn't in real life. Because if I turn this off, you can see that the whole shot turns suddenly a lot more boring, a lot flatter, a lot less colorful. If I turn them back on, there you go. What this is one orange light source, you can see this shining on his face right here, and a green light source, which is lighting up his hair right there in this particular shot. And as we move along through the animations, these light sources, they key with him. So when he is moving to here, to get gear up for the door shot, the light sources actually move with him. As he comes into frame here, if I turn these off again, you can see that, oh, suddenly it's way darker. The only light source we have now is the ambient light source and the door light over here, which, while maybe being more accurate, kind of looks a bit boring, a bit flat, a bit dark. You could light it up, you could make the whole thing brighter, you could add contrast, do sort of all these types of things, but this just made for more colors and more fun warmth and more light, dynamic light sources in the scene in general, I think. So what this is the warm light is lighting up the bottom part of his face here, and the green light is actually very hidden from most things. It's only doing slightly casting slight light on this part of the door, and you can see the handle here, and just in general lighting up the scene a bit more from behind. And then again, as he moves along to the next part, which is here, you can see these light sources, they change position again, from the door to being just in general lighting up his current position, and just giving him more of a, I don't know, more of a standout lighting, I guess, to him. You can see this light source here is giving off some nice reflections on the back of his head here, and this light source up here is just illuminating the main scene a bit more than what would otherwise be. You can see here that it's again turns darker and more flat, and everything kind of blends together a bit more rather than having him stand out and being individually illuminated. You can even see the edge of the green light over here. This is where the green spotlight is touching the ground, and over here it's not. But in the grand scheme of things, and with all the light that is going on and the colors and the movement, it's not really something you think about, but it is something you have to think about when you set it up. Because if this light source was closer to the ground, you'd see that edge show up a lot more. You can see here that it's very prominent, and that would just kind of look weird, and you'd sort of question, wait, where's that light coming from? So using different scenes and different light sources for different purposes is fun and can make for nicer shots than otherwise, but you'd have to be mindful of showing where the light is coming from too much, because if light sources have no actual real space, physical space in the scene, then it starts to look kind of weird, like here. Because where would that light source be coming from? We know that there is nothing above the roof that would cast that light, and it would sort of just make it look less believable and less like an actual scene. So try to keep that in mind if you do these things.
Okay, that's it for part 1. The light and the running is done. Ning. Next up is fire, dangles, and anti. Stick around.